Right, well thank you very much. It's very nice to be here on this appallingly hot day. And it's particularly good to be in this building because you may or may not know that the National Liberal Club was the headquarters of the Britain in Europe movement in 1975. It was from this building that the forces were sent out all across the country that would win that referendum. And so we find in this building and across the campaign, Liberals engaging in all kinds of different activities. If we could have the slide. So just to illustrate the kind of places that we'll find Liberals, here we have Jeremy Thorpe, the party's charismatic and, as it turned out, rather problematic leader, on a platform alongside a Conservative Prime Minister, Edward Heath, and a Labour Home Secretary, Roy Jenkins. Thorpe also appeared, if we have the next slide, in a televised debate at the Oxford Union the week before the votes, which was watched by 11 million people. And here he is doing battle with Barbara Castle over her role in the debate. If we take the next one, please. Might be a less familiar face, but a very interesting one. This is Lady Avebury, whose husband, Eric Lubbock, had won the famous Orpington by-election that sort of kick-started the Liberal revival. And she ran one of the most important offices in Britain and Europe, which was its hugely successful Women's Office. Now, as we'll see, Liberals had an ideological and indeed idealistic commitment to European unity, but they also saw the referendum as an opportunity, both as a publicity vehicle for the party and as a model of the kind of politics in which they believed. So let's start with a little bit of context. The referendum in 75 came as a good time for the Liberal Party, a party that had been destroyed in the 1930s. So within the memory of people like Joe Grimmond, looked for the first time in decades like it was potentially back in business as a party of government. We have the next slide. In the 1974 election in February, the Liberals had won more than 6 million votes, almost triple their total in 1970. That was in fact the largest number of votes that the Liberal Party had ever won, even in 1906 in the landslide or the days of Gladstone. Smaller franchise, of course, the Liberals have never won that kind of total. They have only exceeded that total since, once. I'll leave it to you to guess when that might have been. At the same time, in that election, both the major parties had come below 38%, the first time that that had ever happened. It was the lowest vote share for either party since 1931. So it was plausible to believe that the two-party system was coming to an end, that things like cross-party cooperation, electoral reform, devolution, that these things might be the coming forces in British politics. Thorpe himself radiated youth, dynamism and vitality. He was significantly younger than Harold Wilson or Edward Heath. He travelled around, if we have the next slide, in a hovercraft, like some kind of Bond villain. So for the first time in decades, it was possible to believe that the Liberals might be the future of British politics, and not simply a relic of its past. Now, on the European question specifically, Liberals could plausibly claim to have led the way. The Liberals were the first party to have adopted membership as an official policy. They'd done so shortly after the Treaty of Rome in 1958. And their manifesto in 1975 began, "For Liberals, the pro-Europe campaign is a crusade. We believe in destroying the barriers that divide man from man and nation from nation." Unusually for a British party, they explicitly embraced the idea of federalism. Their manifesto declared, "The trouble is not that political integration has gone too far, but that it has not gone far enough." They called explicitly for a federal Europe, with a directly elected parliament that would supersede national parliaments. And they promised, and I quote, "a militant national campaign to put the positive case for membership." So there's idealism here, but there is also self-interest. The Liberal campaign director, Asa Pinney, sent out a list of objectives for the campaign. Strikingly, winning the referendum was only third on this list, and there were only 3 points. Internally, party strategists were explicit that this was an opportunity to boost membership for the party, to raise the profile of its leaders, and to achieve parity of importance with the other 2 parties. And interestingly, in the archive, there is actually some pushback on that from local parties, some of whom take the view that putting party before country in this way is the sort of thing that the Labour Party does. And even the idealism, the emphasis on federalism, on political union, that was also partly pragmatic. Liberal activists were explicitly warned not to lose your identity while working alongside colleagues of other political persuasions. And they had a bit of a dilemma here. So on the one hand, Liberals wanted to demonstrate that Britain would work better if moderates from all sorts of different parties cooperated. But they also knew that as a party, they drew a lot of protest votes, people who didn't like either of the big 2. And the kind of voters who wouldn't naturally be drawn to an establishment campaign. As one strategist put it, the Liberal campaign must aim to get protest voters to feel that a yes vote can still carry protest overtones. So because of that, there was a lot of emphasis on attacking the common agricultural policy, on attacking tariff barriers with the rest of the world, and in particular, on attacking the other 2 parties. So Labour, for allegedly playing politics with the issue, and the Conservatives for its power-light wing that opposed membership. And that willingness to turn their guns on their allies did not always go down very well with the other parties, not least because they were funding this campaign. And here was a particularly unusual feature for Liberals. This is a party that was used to rattling biscuit tins at jumble sales. Suddenly, it had access to the riches of Britain and Europe, the best funded political campaign probably that Britain has ever had. So David Steele wrote in his memoirs, cars, aeroplanes, helicopters, film units, stage equipment, photocopiers, typewriters, all the materials which Liberals scratched hard to find or finance, simply appeared at a flick of fingers. The Liberals were allocated nearly £100,000 by Britain in Europe, an extraordinary sum in 1975. And the fact that some of the material that paid for seemed to focus more on the Liberals than it did on Europe fed a sense among some of the other activists that, and I quote, Liberals played it dirty. But it also ensured that a more positive voice, a more federalist, a more idealistic voice was heard in a campaign that was much more multivocal than in 2016. Now, it should be said, and we're going to hear more about this later, that not all Liberals were pro-European. If we have the next slide. So some of the founding figures of the Out campaign, people like Christopher Frere-Smith over there, or Oliver Smedley on the right, had been active Liberals. Oliver Smedley had been a Liberal candidate. He had fought Rab Butler in Saffron Walden for the Liberal Party. There was also a Liberal No campaign led by the historian of the Liberal Party, Roy Douglas. And it's probably no accident that Douglas was a historian, because Liberal Out campaigners tended to see themselves as the representatives of an older liberalism, the liberalism of Gladstone, Richard Cobden, John Bright, a liberalism that believes in free trade, small government, non-intervention, facing off against the European community that they saw as being protectionist, bureaucratic, and with ambitions to become a superpower. But like most of the Out campaign vehicles, they struggled to get much media attention, they struggled to raise much money, or to win much support from more recognised figures. Where there was a more visible disagreement was on the decision to hold a referendum in the first place. This was, of course, the first national referendum that Britain had ever had. Nothing like this had ever happened before, and that in itself was quite contentious. Some Liberals quite liked that. Joe Grimmond and David Steele, for example, were both quite drawn to the idea that you could renew Britain's democracy, you could diffuse power from Westminster, you could look for new ways of making decisions. Jeremy Thorpe, on the other hand, was more hostile. He signalled that the Liberal Party would still vote for membership in Parliament even if the referendum went the other way. The party assembly also voted against holding a referendum. So there are shades perhaps here of the debates in the Liberal Democrats in 2019 about whether you needed another referendum in order to cancel Brexit. When polling day came round on the 5th of June, Liberals had the unfamiliar sensation of being on the winning side. A side that had won by a landslide, more than 2-1, voting in favour of staying in. It was hoped that that might inaugurate a new political era, one in which moderates of all parties worked together, in which the extremes of British politics, the Bens and the Powells, were marginalised, in which the Liberal Party sat at the pivot point of British politics. Obviously that didn't really transpire, largely for reasons that lie outside the European question. But of course it was significant that people like Roy Jenkins and Shirley Williams spent the campaign working very closely with Liberals like David Steel, found that they enjoyed it, and I think that was significant in what happens in 1981. It is of course very difficult to quantify how much difference the Liberal campaign made in 1975, but it is perhaps interesting to think about how much of what I've been talking about was then missing in 2016. The Remain campaign in 2016 was much less cross-party. Labour largely sat it out. The Liberal Democrats were still recovering from the defeat in 2015. It was a much more David Cameron-centred, Conservative-focused campaign. It was also a much more fear-based campaign in 2016. It was harder to find people prominently making a positive argument for European integration, and indeed arguing that integration might need to go further. Unlike in 1974, when the Liberal tide was rising, the 2016 vote came after the catastrophe of 2015. And crucially, after 5 years of coalition, it wasn't really possible for Liberal Democrats anymore to argue that they were the protest party, that they were the party that you voted for if you didn't like the big two. And that meant there wasn't really any force in 2016 that was offering an anti-establishment, pro-Remain message that stood outside the big two. And it's striking, if you look at the 20 individuals who appeared most commonly in media coverage of the referendum, not a single one was a Liberal Democrat. There was no one in 2016 who could play the kind of role that Jeremy Thorpe or David Steel had played in the 1970s, or indeed that somebody like Charles Kennedy might have been able to play before 2010. Liberal voices would perhaps become more prominent in the People's Vote campaign, but I will leave it to Morgan to tell us all about that. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Robert. Now, if it's possible, we're going to hear Dr Nick Alderton.
Good evening. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Dr Nicholas Alderton, and I am a Welsh historian. My research interests are 20th century Welsh politics, the Welsh Liberal Party and Plaid Cymru. I would like to thank the Liberal Democrat History Group for inviting me to speak this evening and for allowing me, due to having to work a night shift, to provide my presentation via a pre-recorded video. I have been asked to discuss the opposition within the Liberal Party to join the EEC/Common Market prior to 1975. This presentation will focus on Emlyn Hewson largely because, following the 1970 general election, he was the lone voice among Liberal MPs to oppose entry into the Common Market. However, prior to the 1970 election, no less than 3 of the 12 Liberal MPs elected in 1966 were opposed to entry. These were Hewson, the MP for Montgomery, Peter Bessell, the MP for Bodmin, and Alastair Mackenzie, the MP for Ross and Cromarty. It would be fair to say that even Joe Grimman would waver in his support for entry. Since the 1957 Treaty of Rome, the Liberal Party had come to believe that entry into the EEC/Common Market was vital for the economy of the United Kingdom. Looking through the manifestos, there were mentions of greater European unification, and the first measure of joining the European coal and steel industry community was in 1955, with mention of the Common Market also appearing in 1964. However, the specific demand for entry was made in the 1966 General Election Manifesto with these words: British industry needs the wider horizon of the common market. British exports to Europe have suffered badly from our exclusion. Britain must declare now her intention to join the European community. As we know, in both 1963 and 1967, Britain was denied entry into the EEC twice by President de Gaulle, with just one word: none. It was only following the resignation of de Gaulle in 1969 that the UK was able to restart the negotiations to enter the EEC. De Gaulle's resignation in 1969 appears to have fueled an anti-market sentiment within British politics. Although a minority within their respective parties, the Labour, Conservative and Liberal parties all experienced this, with the press lumping them all together under the moniker of the anti-marketeers. Although it was prior to de Gaulle's resignation, Mackenzie was something of a trailblazer, having been the lone Liberal dissenter during the 10th of May 1967 debate on whether the government should begin a request to start entry negotiations into the EEC. Following the 1967 denial, we see the campaign against joining stepping up. By 1969, for instance, Bessel had become a member of the Tory-led Anti-Common Market League, otherwise known as the ACML. Turning to Hewson, in an April 1967 letter to Lord Ogmore, Hewson wanted to draw a line between the policies of the Welsh Liberals and those of Plaid Cymru. He wrote, "In view of the current debate between Plaid and the Liberals in Wales, I think it is very important to define our policy fairly accurately. We are opposed to economic independence on the grounds that we do not like to see economic barriers raised between nations. We are in favour of political union in Europe, but we think that Wales, like Scotland, should have a very large measure of control over her own affairs. Hence, a policy for a domestic parliament for Wales." However, by 1969, he began to change his stance on a political union with the EEC. Having been an advocate of closer relations, which was in line with his internationalist beliefs, he began to have serious doubts. Whether this was because de Gaulle's resignation had made entry more likely than before, and had focused his mind on what joining the EEC would mean, is hard to say. Yet he came to realise, along with his colleagues Bessel and Mackenzie, what joining would mean, and the issues he focused upon were a loss of sovereignty, the Common Agricultural Policy, otherwise known as CAP, the British government's belief in the economic utopia of the EEC, the plight of the Welsh hill farmers, and his own free trade beliefs. The Liberals held a debate on joining the EEC at the 1969 Autumn Conference. As reported by the Daily Telegraph and the Times, there were a couple of prospective parliamentary candidates, such as Harold Fry, the PPC for St Ives, who were also cautioning against joining. They, along with Bessel, were advocating a solution for a referendum to join the EEC. Although the resolution was defeated, it shows the different result of the 1970 general election could have laid bare that the Liberals were just as disunited as the two main parties. As we know, a referendum was eventually held in 1975. During this debate, Hewson expanded upon his reasons for opposing entry, namely that Britain had missed the opportunity to influence the direction of the EEC by not joining sooner. In an elegant turn of phrase, during what appeared to be a lively debate, he described Britain as the agent maiden in the European matrimonial stakes, further stating that, due to the complete lack of foresight and political ineptitude on the part of the Conservative and Socialist leaders, we miss the European bus and miss it by miles. It is no use now running after it because it is going faster than we are and going in a different direction to that which we intended to take. Further, Hewson felt that, by not getting in on the ground floor, the Labour and Tory parties now give the impression of being determined to get in at any price and whatever the consequences. Effectively, Hewson's argument was, what is the point in joining when the UK would find it hard to influence or change the decisions that have already been made? It was from this point of view that most of his other objections sprang. It must also be noted that Hewson's objections were firmly rooted in how it would affect not just the United Kingdom, but more crucially to him, the impact it would have on Wales. If we look at Hewson's objections, as expressed in his speech to the Commons during the June 1970 United Kingdom and European Communities Bill debate, we can see these threads running through them. Hewson offered four main objections to join the EEC. The first was economic, the second that Britain was not adequately prepared, the third was that the poorer regions would be disproportionately affected, and fourth was that the food and agricultural policy of the common market was fantastically protectionist, his words. On the economic argument, Hewson pointed out that the existing markets which the UK were either targeting or belonged to, namely those in the developing nations and the European Free Trade Association, EFTA, with the latter having a market of 100 million people. Yet Hewson argued Britain had not gained anything from either and had been sidelined by competing nations in the developing world. To Hewson, Britain was deluding itself if it thought it could gain anything by scaling up to a wider market when it was not able to capitalise on a smaller market. He viewed our outdated industry, lack of capital investment, and, in his words, the reserve currency role of sterling as the sacred cow of the British economy, with the development of our own industry being constantly sacrificed to it. His first reason is linked to the second, namely that Britain had not taken adequate steps to prepare itself for the intense competition within the common market. He noted that the unemployment statistics in Britain matched the number of vacancies in West Germany. This situation was not because of the common market, but because Germany had a modern industrial complex and Britain did not. This was despite a decade of trying to join the EEC, being denied entry and not addressing its own industrial inadequacies. This lack of preparation also feeds into his third objection, which was that the poorer parts of Britain have been given a generous amount of funding from the UK government in recent years, but has suffered from underinvestment in the preceding 2 years, so since around 1968-1969. Hewson saw nothing in the regional policy of the EEC that would compensate for this. Finally, Hewson points out that the protectionist nature of the EEC would ensure that the larger farmers would do better than the smaller farmers, in his words, in the less favoured areas of the country. His reasoning amounted to the fact that Britain imported 51% of its food and the EEC had a surplus of temperate foodstuff. By gaining access to the British market, the EEC would want to hang on to it and protect it. The larger industrial farmer would then have protections it had not yet previously enjoyed. The smaller farmer, such as the hill farmers of Wales, would struggle to compete. Hewson did concede that the economic benefits of the common market in the long terms could be considerable, but he was not prepared to see those in the poorer areas of Britain paying the high price of joining in the medium term, when the country was not well prepared or on the terms that had been negotiated with the EEC. In other correspondence, Hewson also remarked that he opposed joining on political grounds. He pointed to certain sections of the EEC that were eager for Britain's entry because they wanted to get, in his words, British atomic know-how for a European nuclear deterrent eventually. This related to his wider concern about Britain being compelled to relinquish more of its sovereignty. As is well known, Hewson was the only Liberal to vote against joining the EEC during the historic October 28, 1971 Commons vote, which approved the UK's accession to the EEC. However, as Hewson was away, he did not vote on the third reading of the European Communities Bill in July 1972, which allowed Britain to join the EEC on January 1, 1973. Hewson, as the lone Liberal MP against entry, did experience a certain amount of animosity from within the Welsh Liberal Party. The minutes of one meeting stated that a lively discussion had taken place about his common market views. Additionally, Jeremy Thorpe wrote in a reply to a letter from the Welsh Liberal Party treasurer, Rhys Guerin-Lloyd, expressing his views on Hewson. He implied that Hewson had made his choice. In his words, as to the different views of some Liberal leaders over the common market, my impression was that almost every leading Liberal took one line in favour. Emlyn, almost alone, was against. The fault lies not in us, dear Brutus. However, it would be fair to say that other members of the Parliamentary Liberal Party also shared Hewson's objections. For example, Joe Grimman wavered on whether to support entry, but eventually would fall into line. Despite Houston's objections, once the results of the 1975 public referendum were known, he and the newly elected Gareth Howells, who was the MP for Cardigan and then Ceredigion, who had also taken a similar line to Houston and joined the EEC, issued a joint statement on what they wanted to see happen. This amounted to Wales having a deeper role with the EEC as part of a Europe of the nations, rather than a Europe of the outmoded, old-fashioned states. He had not come around to the EEC, but was prepared to take a pragmatic approach. In a 1994 lecture to the Welsh Political Archive at the National Library of Wales, Houston's stance had changed, and he believed that he would have voted for entry, but stated that, in his words, "I believe my reasons for delaying our entry, as I explained them then, largely proves to be correct." In a prescient end to the lecture, he pointed out that the idea of a united Europe, with one currency, one defence force, no internal economic barriers, one basic business language eventually, with total support for cultural languages, and with complete devolved control over domestic issues to provincial parliaments, of which Wales would be one, is still the answer. This is such a crucial issue now and for the future that I foresee that it will provoke eventually a huge political crisis which possibly could result in a realigning of political parties in Wales and the United Kingdom. In any event, I shall almost certainly not be here to experience the crisis or its resolution. Sadly, Houston was correct. Having died in 2012, he did not see the crisis or its resolution, such as it has been. However, the arguments that Houston put forward for staying out of the EEC are quite familiar to those that were touted in the period up to the 2016 referendum. However, it must be said that Houston's opposition was not based on political expediency or a fear of the other, but on the economic and industrial state of Britain at the time, the protection of Wales and its agricultural base, all of which, he argued, needed to be sorted out before entry. He was not against entry, but felt that Britain was not ready at the time and had missed the boat in being able to influence the direction of the EEC from its inception. He felt it would be better to focus on change in Britain and then wait to be asked to join, implying that the UK would have a stronger hand. Thank you for listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Good night.
Then move on to Morgan.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I'm just setting my talk up. A bit shorter than everyone else talking here this evening. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk to you. I'm here to talk about my forthcoming book, No Second Chances, which is about the anti-Brexit movement. I thought I would just give a kind of quick précis on the campaign and the argument of the book, which is out in October. You can pre-order it now. I chose something of a preemptive apology, because despite being very pleased to have been asked to speak at the Liberal Democrat History Group, there aren't a huge amount of Liberal Democrats in my book. This is partly owing to my long history in the Labour Party and the solipsism of that party. But it also has there are kind of other reasons for this as well. Obviously, it was a time, as Rob has referred to, when the party was at a very low ebb in terms of seat numbers post 2015. And while there was significant debate over kind of what kind of anti-Brexit the Liberal Democrats would be doing, they weren't really a kind of space of contestation for the anti-Brexit movement in the same way that Labour or the softer parts of the Tory party were, because they were just kind of in it. You know, there was not a sort of mainstream Leave liberalism that was there to fight that out. There was, however, in this period, quite a lot of people trying to reinvent the Liberal Democrats from first principles, with endless sort of new centrist parties, which is quite a lot in the book. But anyway, onto the précis of the book itself. So as soon as there was a vote to leave in 2016, there was a second referendum. They are coterminous ideas, basically. On the 24th of June 2016, Jolyon Maugham was writing about the possibility of a second vote on his blog. By the 5th of September that year, a petition on a new referendum had garnered more than 4 million signatures and was debated in the House of Commons. The precise nature of what this new referendum would be shifted. That first petition was calling for a kind of voiding of the referendum based on the turnout was too low and the quorum was too high. There should be 60% to be a valid deal, so they had to redo it. Later on, a vote on a final deal became the kind of more popular format. But whatever the kind of like desired form of the new referendum was, kind of inescapable in this period. Between the close of polls on the 23rd of June 2016 and the close of polls on the 12th of December 2019, it was kind of one of the defining ideas. In the book, I argue, and perhaps this won't be a wholly popular argument in this room, that it was an idea that was kind of flawed from the start. As one senior People's Vote staffer told me, I don't think there is a way in which you can say to however many million people you were wrong without just saying you were wrong. There are better and worse ways of saying you were wrong, but fundamentally you are just saying to someone, you were wrong. And it's not like you were wrong 10 years ago, you were wrong 2 years ago. And obviously you can say that this is without saying because you're a moron, or it's because you're gullible, or because you're thick. And it's better when you don't say any of those things, but you're still saying to someone, you were wrong, right? As political scientist Rob Ford put it to me, any campaign that was built around that impulse, the impulse to say you're wrong, is doomed from the start, because you are starting from a position of not respecting the legitimacy of the choice of people who disagree with you. This is also something I know that Rob has written about in his excellent article, How Do We Write the History of Brexit, where he reflects that much academic writing suggests a striking reluctance to engage with the opposing side as a serious moral or intellectual position, which is, I think, also a problem the anti-Brexit movement had kind of on a wider scale. And in practical terms, I would say it is probably a worse problem for political operatives to have than it is a problem for academics to have. But to move on to those political operatives, who were the kind of actors in the movement? How were they prosecuting their case for a new referendum in this period? So as I say, the appeal of the new vote was the idea of the new vote was kind of instantaneous after the Brexit vote, but it really kicked into overdrive after the 2017 general election. Obviously that, I don't need to tell you, remade the political map. Theresa May lost the majority. And while Labour did not have an anti-Brexit position at that general election, I think its success there its sort of qualified success there can be understood as, in part, as having benefited from anti-Brexit sentiments. People weren't kind of checking the small print of Labour's position as they would come to do in 2018, 2019. So by the time of the 2017 election, a great many groups had already been formed to fight Brexit, some of which, such as In Facts and Another Europe is Possible, actually predated the referendum. They were there to fight the 2016 referendum. Some of which, like Best for Britain, which was enormously well funded, so it kind of became one of the bigger actors in the space through that, was set up after the referendum. Also springing up in this period were a number of youth campaigns. For Our Future's Sake was the brainchild of a bunch of former NUS elected vice presidents, and had sort of serious links to the youth movement, to the organised student movement. The kind of far richer text in the youth movement, in the anti-Brexit youth movement space, can you believe that there's more than one text there, that is Our Future, Our Choice, which was fronted by Lara Spirit, who is now a noted Times journalist, Femi Oluwole, who is now a noted poster, and Will Dry, who became a spad to Rishi Sunak, but was more recently spotted in a Hope Not Hate report about the promotion of race science networks in Westminster. It was also set up with significant support from a French man in his 40s named Felix Marquardt, who is a sort of one of the great interesting characters of the anti-Brexit movement. He was the sort of son of a wealthy Paris family. He was very rebellious. He set up a rap label in the 1990s. His rap label was not very successful, so he had to use his rappers to do search engine optimization. Unfortunately, he could only get search engine optimization work from sex websites, and so his rappers just had to sit around Googling tits all day. This eventually came a cropper when he directed search terms for the mayor of Paris to pornographic websites. He then converted to Islam, set up a think tank to reform Islam, ended up on a ISIS hit list, set up a different think tank with Daniel Cohn-Bendit, the 68er, if anyone's interested in that period of history, which was about getting young people to travel the world. Then he sets up another think tank called Euthonomics. He is by this point in his late 30s. And it is through this that he comes to be one of the core instigating founders of Our Future, Our Choice, an anti-Brexit youth movement. Very interesting man. Wouldn't be interviewed by me. But the most important organisation in this space was Open Britain, which was the legal inheritor of Britain Stronger In, which was the Designated Remain campaign, of course. And being the Designated Remain campaign means that you are possessed of the data of the campaign, which was sort of the kind of golden egg. I don't have the precise figure on it, but hundreds of thousands of email addresses, probably upwards of 500,000. And so that became, Open Britain and the data from the formal Remain campaign became the kind of hub around which the People's Vote campaign was formed in April 2018. So the People's Vote campaign was actually a number of different organisations, and it never really reconciled itself. So you have the youth campaigns I've just been talking about. You also have Scientists for Labour, Britain for Europe, the European movement. Some of these organisations are quite a lot realer than other organisations, which is another kind of rub point where, Open Britain is quite a big organisation with quite a lot of data. The European movement has quite a long history. Scientists for Labour is basically two guys. Scientists for Europe, sorry. Labour Pipeline. Roland Rudd, the PR guru and brother of Amber, and obviously former David Owen staffer in the 1980s, was the chair of Open Britain and therefore of the People's Vote campaign. His long-standing friend Hugo Dixon, the journalist and chair of InFact, became the deputy chair of the People's Vote campaign. However, these positions were very much contested by the people running things day to day. James McGrory, a former spinner for Nick Clegg, who was the sort of CEO, I think is the term, and Tom Baldwin, the Times journalist turned Ed Miliband era comms chief for the Labour Party. Tom Baldwin has said that Hugo Dixon's position within the People's Vote campaign was not more legitimate than the medals Idi Amin gave himself, which is quite an insane thing to, well, I don't know if it's insane, it's quite a heavy thing to say about someone you work with quite closely. As you can see, there was not a lot of love lost between different parts of the campaign, which we'll come to discuss. So they get together in April 2018. They never really reconcile their governance structure. They all move into Millbank Tower together to fight the good fight. They're pretty successful at it. The issue becomes more salient. They have some absolutely massive marches. MPs begin to shift, particularly Labour MPs. They have throughout a problem, however. The name of the game is persuasion, getting people who didn't agree with you to agree with you. But unfortunately, they are drawing resources from a base which is becoming increasingly polarising, increasingly dogmatic, increasingly convinced that Brexit's wrong, people who voted for Dem, we need to be, the case that Rob has been making about the sort of bloodless nature of the formal Remain campaign in 2016 was the sort of the thing that we just flip the switch, we become much more pro-Europe, and we'll solve it. And they were pulling in a huge amount of money from their base. They were pulling in at one point in email donations alone, 100k a week in 2019. So massive amounts of money are coming in, and it's a sort of there's a sort of audience capture loop problem where do I have to become more pro-European to get more money, but then so on and so forth. It's a political problem it's a problem that political movements and parties often face. The base of the Labour Party, the base of the Tory Party, the kind of dragging nature of these things. And it came to a head in June 2019 when various people within the campaign wanted to have a specifically anti-Boris march, whereas the likes of Tom Baldwin and James McGrory were saying, no, we are just at this moment trying to persuade soft Tories to join us. We need Antoinette Sandbach, we don't need the anti-Boris march. And so that caused a big rupture in the campaign. They did ultimately basically hit something of a limit, however. I spoke to one of the people who was doing polling for the campaign, who said that while there was a tilt in the years after the vote, that roughly flipped Leave versus Remain preferences. So more people wanted to remain than to leave. Most people's keenest preference was to never, ever, ever hear about Brexit again. And so the second referendum has managed to pick all the low-hanging fruit, all the first they came for the Liberal Democrats, then the parts of the Labour Party they could get, then the parts of the Tory Party they could get, but there was a ceiling on it. You could only reach so far. And so I think they did a pretty good job at getting everyone they could have gotten, but I'm quite unconvinced by arguments that they were 20 votes away, almost. I think they maxed it out, to be honest. And this this kind of became apparent to a lot of people when I interviewed someone who said, when I saw Leo Varadkar meeting Boris Johnson in October 2019, and they said, we can see a pathway to a deal, they knew it was over. And lo, it kind of was. And so the dramatic blow-up of the campaign, while long in gestation and to do with these personality clashes I've been making reference to, was basically post hoc, and it was quite a lot to do with the fight over the assets, which then at that point was the expanded data list, which obviously used to fuel quite a massive campaign. So does anyone know what happened to the People's Vote campaign, the legal entity? What is it now? It is the APPG for Fair Elections, which is a proportional representation campaign run by so it ended up as that. My kind of argument is that a lot of, maybe this is me spending too much time around kind of Charter 88 people, but I do think that if you stand still as a progressive in British politics, you turn into a campaign for proportional representation. It's what happened to the Communist Party through Unlock Democracy, and that is what happened to the People's Vote campaign. They would obviously say that they are still very much alive and kicking entity. They are still, it is Open Britain, it's still technically the organisation, but it's the APPG for Fair Elections is what they are predominantly doing. There ends my talk.
Right, Duncan.
Thanks very much. Probably most of you heard me say all this before, but there may be one or two of you who haven't been to one of our meetings before. So just say a few words about the Liberal Democrat History Group. So we were founded in 1988, when this party was founded, to promote research and discussion of the history of the party's predecessors, the Liberal Party and the SDP. Liberal Party, of course, has a history going right back into the 17th century, SDP rather more recent in the 80s. And we do this in four main ways. We published the Journal of Liberal History. This is the latest issue, just out a couple of months ago, with articles, biographies, book reviews, reports of meetings. We'll have a report of this one in due course. The next one will be out in about a month's time, perhaps a little bit more, and it's a special issue, themed issue, on the topic of the survival of the Liberal Party in the 30s, 40s and 50s, at its lowest point, so before the period we were talking about before. So hopefully this will be encouraging to all of us who've lived through the last decade or so. We organise meetings like this one. The next meeting we'll be organising will be at the Liberal Democrat Conference in September in Bournemouth. It's on the Saturday of the conference, which I think is the 20th of September. You'll need to be registered for the conference to go to it, but we'll put a recording of it up on the website afterwards. And we are looking at the philosophical origins of what the party believes, with speakers John Parry from Cambridge, talking about his new book called Liberalism, which is a very good read. I recommend it. And also David Howarth, who's a former Lib Dem MP for Cambridge. And we'll be launching the latest edition of our own new booklet on liberalism, the ideas that built the Liberal Democrats. So really sort of a concise summary of the main philosophical themes that came together to form what this party believes. We maintain a website, liberalhistory.org.uk, and we publish a number of booklets and books. I mentioned the one on liberalism. We also have two introductory booklets, just a concise history of the party and liberal politics in Britain, and one of our latest publications, What Have the Liberals Ever Done for Us? the greatest achievements of Liberal governments and Liberal Democrat MPs over the last 350 years. So I hope if you aren't already a subscriber to us, I hope you do decide to subscribe. It only costs £30 a year for print subs and £25 for digital online subs. And you can see all the more information about it on our website. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Duncan. We're now going to have questions, and for purposes of the recording, it is very helpful if you could speak into the microphone, which Neil will bring to you. If you want to direct a question to somebody in particular on the panel, please say so, but let's hope most of them can be to everybody. Right, somebody over there.
Graham Colley, you mentioned that the problem with the second referendum was the question of legitimacy. We had a referendum and therefore it was decided. Do you think there was any argument that could have defeated that could have been brought forward to persuade people that they weren't at fault and it was about reconsidering it?
Are we doing rounds, or is it just...
Start with you, since
Yes.
it's the aim your way.
I mean, look, I think Sarah Hobolt, the political scientist, has done some very interesting work on the necessity of losers' consent, and you have to have losers' consent for a good functioning democracy. I think that it is just about possible to imagine a sort of more holistic campaign for a new referendum that could have done that. I think that wasn't the one that we had. I think that it suffered from, as did the sort of pro-Brexit side, it suffered from a sort of an intensification and a polarisation, and as I said, a reasonably heavy degree, I think, of audience capture to do with resource and to do with what you say in order to get financing and resource. People donate when they feel good, and the sort of half-hearted, well, no one's really that happy about this deal, but doesn't get people to give money. And so I think the incentive structures that existed in British politics at that time and at this time weren't really there to create that kind of campaign. And I also think that wasn't kind of the thinking of the kind of people who were running it. I think that they thought, a quote that I often return to that I find very interesting is Tom Baldwin, the director of Commons People's Vote campaign, said that when People's Vote campaign was successful, it was a machine for pointing out the sort of problems and follies of Brexit as it was actually existing and as it was actually happening in kind of Parliament 2018, 2019. And when it was unsuccessful, it was a demonstration of Remain ideology. And I think it was primarily ended up being much too much the latter to be meaningfully successful at the former, or as successful as it needed to be. So basically maybe, but that wasn't the world we lived in, I think.
Not about trying to chip in. So I know much less about this than Morgan does, but just on a personal level, I was very strongly opposed to a second referendum, but I ended up being a supporter of a people's vote. And I think it is possible, I agree this isn't what happened, but it is possible to separate those two things. So I think the idea of saying to the public, you got this wrong, even though that was my view, is not going to work. It is going to, at best, you have a rerun, and maybe it's 52-48 the other way. That doesn't solve the problem. I think the democratic problems here would have been absolutely enormous. So I don't think it was ever viable to say we've had a referendum, we got the wrong answer, now we're going to do it again. But as we discovered in 2017, 2018 and 2019, the referendum in 2016 had left a lot of questions unanswered. Specifically, what were the terms on which we were actually going to leave? What was the deal going to be? And there was a point at which it was clear that Parliament was entirely unable to answer that question. And I don't think it was unreasonable at that point to say, well, let's take the deal and put it to the public and see whether they want this specific deal. Now, would that have worked? I don't know. I think it was constitutionally more defensible. And it's a different kind of claim to say, do you want Theresa May's deal or do you not? Or do you want Boris Johnson's deal or do you not? but perhaps you think that's nonsense.
I suppose I think that that's all entirely correct on paper, but that when it comes to who you actually had doing the campaign for the second referendum, for the people's vote, for the second referendum, for the final say, whatever you want to call it, they realistically were people who wanted to remain, and you can't tell me you couldn't tell people it wasn't, and so.
Yeah.
You know, I interviewed people who were involved in organisations that didn't come out for a people's vote or a second referendum until, you know, sort of midway through 2017 and early 2018. But they said, it was, sort of end of June 2016, we knew this was what we were going to do. And I think people can see that. I don't want to do the sort of like, they're lying eyes answer, but like, I think that was kind of evident, but I don't know.
Start there.
Thanks. Is that working?
No.
No?
Just speak up.
Speak up, yeah. Just try this one. Hello? Yeah? Okay? Okay. Speak right. Simon Morrow from East Surrey. I experienced 1975 as one of my first votes as an idealistic pro-European. I experienced 2016 as a gnarled Liberal Democrat activist trying to work with other parties, not terribly successfully. What struck me in 2016, and I expected the vote to go the way it did, was that it was a lot of people saying, our life is rubbish, we want to change things. Europe is one of the reasons our life is rubbish, all these Polish plumbers, etc. They've had years and years and years of diatribes from the Daily Mail telling how awful Europe was. And people were coming out voting who didn't know how to vote, didn't normally vote, and in order to get rid of their Polish neighbours. Do you think, in 1975, obviously didn't have the experience, but do you think there was a similar wave in 1975 that was in favour of Europe because they thought their lives were rubbish then, and by changing to go into Europe, they knew that the standard of living was higher in Germany and France and whatnot, and they thought, right, this could improve our lives. So in a funny way, both votes were similar, and that they were people voting for change against their rather tedious and unhappy lives.
Robert, is that a picture you recognise?
I do think a big part of the 1975 vote was the sense that this was a crisis election. That if you look at the manifestos in 1974, the word crisis is all over them. Labour's manifesto is even called Labour's Way Out of the Crisis. And the preface of every manifesto is about the grave economic and constitutional crisis that faces this country. If you read The Sun in 1975, as I'm sure many people here did, the strapline on every page during the referendum period is Crisis Britain, Crisis Britain. You've just had the 3-day week previously. You can stand up as a pro-European in 1975 and say, if we leave, then the economy will collapse. The lights will go out. And regardless of whether or not that's true, that is a sellable line in 1975. So, firstly, it means that the risk of a leave vote seems to be very much higher. There's a line in Tony Benn's diaries from December 1974, where he says, the final collapse of capitalism might be only weeks away. Of course, he thinks that's great. It's a harder sell in some ways to say to people, vote to leave the European community because it will bring on the crisis. Whereas one problem in 2016 was that Project Fear, as it was called, was essentially reduced to saying GDP will grow less quickly by this amount over a 30-year event horizon, which doesn't quite have the bite that the kind of crisis message has in 1975. So, insofar as there is a sense of discontent and crisis in 2016, I think you're right, that Europe is seen as being part of that. It's the crisis in the Eurozone, it's the crisis on the Channel, it's the border crisis on the Mediterranean, and the European community seems to be a cause of that, rather than a solution to it. So I do think, yes, the kind of politics of dystopia is present in both referendums, but it works in completely different ways.
Right. How does the young man back?
Hey, I'd just like to ask, as a matter of bringing up, as a matter of the principles of liberalism. I'm Russian, and I break a cold sweat at night thinking about my family time. I was wondering, do you think that the Lib Dems' new policy on tactical nuclear arms is reconcilable with the foundational principles of liberalism?
I'm going to hand that to Robert to start with, and
So-
let Morgan think about it as a Labour Party person.
So, forgive me, I don't actually know what the Lib Dem policy is that you're. So could you explain?
Duncan might.
Nick Clegg was very anti-nuclear arms and Trident, but now we've started moving back towards Trident and moving away from nuclear disarmament as a core Lib Dem policy. I was wondering if you think having nuclear arms at our disposal to use is at odds with the foundational principles of liberalism. Is the free market?
I have to correct you on that. The party has never had a policy position of getting rid of British nuclear weapons. We've had different positions in terms of reducing or moving away from continuous at-sea deterrence, so kind of scaling it down a bit. But the Liberal Democrats have never had a policy of wanting to scrap Trident or not have nuclear weapons. I have to say I don't know what we've said in response to the latest news about increasing Britain's nuclear weapons, but I'm afraid what you said is not correct.
But for anyone who doesn't know, Duncan's a former director of policy for the Liberal Democrats.
That was some time ago.
So just should I quickly respond to that? Or?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question, and I think actually it does connect to our subject tonight, which is that there's a reason why subjects like nuclear weapons and European integration are so divisive for political parties, which is that those political traditions weren't built for those kind of questions. They predate them. So you can draw on different antagonistic threads within the tradition. So there are people celebrated in this building, like Richard Cobden and John Bright, for whom liberalism was all about peace. And the idea that building up armaments to them was one of the least liberal things that a country could do. So there's a kind of Cobdenite, Bright tradition in liberalism that I think is still present in the anti-nuclear movement in the 20th century. Someone like Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, is an anti-nuclear activist because he's a liberal. But you can also find other parts of liberalism that are, there's an older tradition which is Britain doesn't intervene in the rest of the world, but it has a strong fleet that protects its borders. And you can see how you can translate that idea that we have a nuclear deterrent that protects our borders, and that enables a kind of liberal politics inside. So, I don't think we can say it's either for or against the traditions of liberalism, but we can, in wrestling with these questions, people can reach into different bits of the liberal past and try to find different ideas that will help them steer.
And there is an active anti-nuclear group within the party. They're just in the minority.
But you can imagine Palmerston wanting a bomb.
Absolutely.
I am a very committed social democrat. I run a journal of social democracy, so I'm not going to pronounce on the internal decisions of other traditions.
Right, in the corner there.
Just a quick recollection first. You mentioned helicopters and things like that. I was asked by David Ossett, who won the by-election a couple of years before when we were in the middle of this campaign, if I could send out to land Jeremy Thorpe's helicopter. On the basis that I was a scout leader. Because I was a scout leader, I must know how to land a helicopter. I did it successfully. Getting all the flares on a Sunday afternoon was quite challenging, but anyway, no. Right, coming to the question. I'm old enough to remember both campaigns. Maybe it's because I'm getting older. I think the first one was more honest than the second one. In all the campaigns I've fought, which ever since David Ossett's by-election, I've fought election ever since then. I don't think I've ever fought in an election so dishonest as the second referendum. It just seemed to me, both sides, the Leave side perhaps telling more lies than the other. I don't think either side were very honest, which is, I think, really a very poor campaign. I wonder what your views were on that.
Morgan.
Yeah, I mean, so In Fact, which was one of the constituent organisations of the People's Vote campaign, was set up as a kind of like fact-check service, basically by a bunch of journalists. And realistically, it was mostly about the Leave campaign, and I think the idea that the Leave campaign was lying was a sort of incredibly fundamental, kind of almost like a core text of the subsequent People's Vote campaign. Like I interviewed the woman who invented the blue barrow of the stars, the BU ray, and you order one of those online, and she sends you a hat and a bunch of fake money called the Bank of Brexit, which says the Bank of Brexit lies on it. So it's a really kind of core like belief there. But admittedly, In Fact also had a section called In Sins, which was about lies of the Remain campaign, and so it's like neither. I think it became so sort of fraught and emotional, and also very deeply tied up with people's identity and their sense of self. And I think when that is the kind of conversation you're having, weird like distortions of subjectivity and also deliberate outright lies, because it's so important that I'll just get it over the line. I'll like kind of enter into the field. Yeah, but I don't want to be too mealy-mouthed. I feel like in this conversation I'm coming across as very pro-Brexit, which I'm not. I worked for the Labour Remain campaign, such as it was, and I'm not a UK citizen, so I was very opposed. And so I think at the end of the day, it was distortions of fact. Boris Johnson, it's just as likely as you'd think. But it was a sort of like a broader kind of distortion field, I think, around the intensity of the debate created these problems on both sides, I think.
Standards of honesty in 75.
Well, I think it's the nature of referendums and elections generally that to some extent they reflect the times in which they happen. They're sort of gathering points, and I think that was very apparent in 2016. That 2016 was about lots of things that weren't Europe. And they told us a lot about the country that we didn't necessarily know. And so the 2016 campaign absolutely exhibited, I think, all of the worst features of contemporary politics. The hyperpolarization, the hyperpolarized media, a massive collapse of trust in not just politicians, but in almost all forms of expertise. So as Tony mentioned, I co-run an organisation at Queen Mary called the Mile End Institute. And we did lots of events in 2016 that was purely educational. They were purely about what does the EU do, what is the common agricultural policy. And it was extraordinary. It was like blowing into a hurricane. Just the sheer impossibility and the anger actually in the audience when someone told them something that they didn't believe to be true. And the sense that we must be being paid. It was quite awful to see. I think probably, most of us here will think more of the dishonesty of the Leave campaign, but it's also clear that things like the Treasury documents that were put out by the Remain campaign were in all sorts of ways manifestly untrue. So that, it's not a pretty referendum to look back on. I don't think those problems were as severe in 1975 because those weren't the dominant problems of the political culture. On the other hand, there were other problems in 1975. For example, that the Remain campaign had more money left over at the end than the total spend of the Leave campaign. In financial terms, this was an impossible contest for the Leave campaign. The fact that every national newspaper, except for the Spectator and the Morning Star, supported the Remain campaign meant that the media environment was hopelessly unbalanced as well. So I think there were lots of things wrong in 75 too. I don't want to be too starry-eyed about it, but I do also think there's a particular dishonesty problem in 2016.
Okay. Gentleman in blue.
Oh, the microphone can work?
No, it seems to be the case.
Alright. My question is sort of a very looked-at question in the sense you were saying that some of the key figures of the Labour Alliance would have been working with Liberals at that point. Do you think that the SCP Liberal Alliance happens in the same way it happens at all? If it's not for the networks built up during the 75 referendum? And sort of similarly for Morgan, do you think you can draw a line from the people voting in the 16 referendum to the sort of expanded Lib Dems that we today under a Davey, or do you think they're kind of different things or not directly related?
Do you want to go first?
Yes, I absolutely. I'm going to take liberty and say that I think that you can see that line, but you can see very directly a line from the SDP into the People's Vote campaign, as I was just discussing before the talk. Sorry. You know, you've got Roland Rudd, who's the chair, who worked for David Owen. You've got Andrew Adonis, who is obviously in the SDP. You've got Hugo Dixon, who also worked for Bob McLennan in the late 1980s. You've got quite a lot of people who started their political lives in one way or another in the SDP. They've largely kind of come out of it and largely kind of come out of politics, but they kind of get back in the game for one last thing in the People's Vote campaign. I had someone say to me that that they felt that this was for a lot of people, for a lot of kind of older people who'd been, you know, kind of political, but like never politicians, quite successful, but maybe not successful as they wanted. It was like this sort of, you know, this was their 60s in Paris. It was like, it was all on the line and they could get back into it. I think you can very directly draw a line from the 2016 and the People's Vote world to the current, expanded Liberal Democrats, and I think that line does not necessarily go through the Liberal Democrats. You know, Chris Coughlin, the Liberal Democrat MP, has been much in the news over the last few days. If you're me, maybe not that much in the news. He was heavily involved with the Renew Party in 2018, 2019. He was, you know, there were a lot of people who were kind of anti-Brexit independents who have washed back into the Liberal Democrat, found their political home in the Liberal Democrats. That's partly a function of Change UK's like eventual merger with, or sort of pseudo merger with the Liberal Democrats. So you have like Chuck Moona's chief of staff remains Daisy Cooper's head chief of staff to this day. The line there is, sorry, I'm talking to Liberal Democrats who know a lot more than this than I do.
Sorry, just forgotten about my existence at Change UK.
Yes, I was worried you were going to be like, that's my husband. But yeah, so there's clearly this line back from the SDP into this world. There's also very clearly this line through the kind of new centrist party's naughty world of the kind of Brexit years into the current Liberal Democrats, I think.
And on the question of would it have happened anyway, there's a book on the 75 referendum, and a very good book by Anthony King, which he wrote immediately after the referendum. And in the final chapter, he talks about what would have happened if Leave had won. And he says, well, if Leave had won, then Tony Benn and the Labour left would have taken over the Labour Party. And people like Roy Jenkins and Shirley Williams would probably have become so discontented that they would have left. And they'd probably have been drawn across to the Liberals. We might have seen some kind of alliance between the Labour soft left and the Liberal Party. And of course, it's a reminder that history moves in mysterious ways, and that sometimes we reach the same outcome by different routes. It's also a reminder that the strains that drove people like Jenkins out of the Labour Party were already there, and that the European issue was just one part of that. In fact, to some extent, the people who run the Remain campaign in 75 are the semi-dispossessed of British politics. It's Edward Heath, who's just lost to the Conservative leadership and is watching Margaret Thatcher carry us in a new direction. It's Roy Jenkins, who's already kind of disillusioned with the Labour Party. And it's a moment that allows them to step outside the nightmares of their own parties and do something different. So I think it probably strengthens their sense that another politics is possible, and it strengthens their pleasure in working in one another's company. But it probably doesn't change the kind of deep tectonic plates that are pushing the lands up in different shapes.
I'm going to take gentleman there and then there.
Is this working?
It
Oh,
is.
right, okay. Seth Tallock, I was also involved in both referendum campaigns. What interested me about those was that in 1975, members of the public who canvassed were very clear how they were voting and why they were voting for it. In 2016, it struck me as a lot of ordinary people didn't really know and didn't really become tribal until after they'd cast their ballot, in which case they all saw themselves as part of something that they hadn't really been part of. If I can make one other point relating to what's just been said about the campaign for a second referendum, I have to say I'm a bit concerned about my perception of what happened there, because I think the whole problem for its non-success lay with Open Britain, and I'll tell you for why. There were a lot of people, Liberal Democrats and disillusioned either still in or former Conservatives, who knew how to campaign, who were experienced, and the money went to Open Britain, which struck me as being run by the sort of people who, yes, Social Democrats is a good description of them, didn't actually know how to run that sort of campaign. And I thought at the time that they started operating as a bit of a clique and freezing out people like Liberal Democrats and like the Michael Heseltines and plenty of other Tories of that type at the time. And I thought the whole thing went wrong when they became the lead organisation. Sorry about that, but that was my feeling at the time, and it was very much my feeling now.
Do you want to answer that point first?
Yeah, I mean, I would probably agree with you, and absolutely wouldn't dare to speak for Open Britain. Yeah, I think that there were these kind of tensions between Open Britain becoming the lead organisation was a very fraught decision in and of itself. There were a lot of contentions, as you mentioned, about finances. Britain for Europe was, and the European movement were arguably the two organisations which had a kind of quasi-merger, were arguably the two organisations that had the kind of biggest grassroots presence. And so the people who were kind of senior in those organisations, particularly in Britain for Europe, were very, very unhappy with the way they were treated by kind of Millbank on high. Yeah, and I think this allegation of kind of clickiness goes is one that I came to interview about sort of 67 people for the book, most of whom had worked in one way or another on the campaign or been volunteers or so on and so forth. And there was quite a lot that kind of tension between the grassroots and the top of the organisation was very present. I would, while it was also, I would slightly question the precise political nature of that though, because I think it is, like Heseltine was touring the country for the People's Vote campaign, and I think that there were, oh my god, Tory. Sorry.
The point I was making is not the political differences, but the fact that the people who really had experience and knew how to run public campaigns seemed to be the people who were being frozen out, whereas the people who were running Open Britain, and you can tell the organisation is still going, it's completely gone, well, I mean, it's just weird. I get their emails, the things they campaign about, don't have a clue how to campaign, and what went wrong was the leadership of the campaign fizzled out with that sort of decision. I think if somebody else had been made the lead organisation, that campaign could have been won.
I suppose the question there is then, when you're saying the leadership of the campaign was the problem, which leadership? So is it Roland Rudd, or is it Tom Baldwin and James McGrory? And they hate each other. Arguably they're both the leadership, and that's kind of the problem. But then, argue the people who are running the kind of grassroots organisations, the Britain for Europe, so this guy called Tom Buffato, who's now at Best Britain, who was chair of Britain for Europe, would make the claim that they had the most legitimacy, that they were the real sort of grassroots powerhouse. And so, I mean, these governance issues were the kind of reason why it ultimately didn't really work. But I think basically everyone involved in the campaign would probably say some variant of that, but they would all have a different organisation or set of people who were at fault. So, yeah.
Robert, do you want to take the broader point about people identifying more strongly with the side they've chosen after they've chosen it?
Yeah, I do think that was a really striking phenomenon, wasn't it? That we didn't really have Leavers and Remainers until the 24th of June. And suddenly, and it's partly, of course, because the Remain campaign woke up after defeats, that for the first time Britain had a pro-European movement on the 24th of June. And people were wearing wristbands and they were wearing, EU T-shirts, and we hadn't seen that before. And it's partly because, of course, in 1975 that didn't happen, because 1975 is a referendum that just continued the status quo. To some extent, once the polls had closed and been counted, politics could then carry on as before. Whereas 2016 blew everything apart. It blew up the leadership of the Conservative Party, it ended the Cameron era, it launched a bomb in the Labour Party about the future of Jeremy Corbyn, and we then had to spend 3 years working out what we were going to do about this. So it did make possible a whole new politics. And I guess on the point about the people who knew how to win campaigns, I wonder if there's also just a wider problem there, which is that if you look at the Leave campaign in 2016, it's full of people who had spent years doing street politics. People like Cummings had fought several referendums. They knew how to fight a street campaign outside the party system. Whereas David Cameron and George Osborne knew how to beat Ed Miliband. They knew how to run a particular kind of party-based campaign in a normal general election. They actually had very little experience of the kind of politics that they encountered in that referendum. Jess Phillips has talked about how she was a brilliant campaigner for the Labour Party in Birmingham, but suddenly she had no data anymore. She didn't know where people were. She didn't know which doors that she should knock on. So actually, Remain just didn't have that kind of expertise. And of course, an even wider problem is that actually our electoral politicians nowadays tend to have very narrow experience because political careers are so short. So David Cameron's whole strategy in 2016 was based on the 2015 campaign and the 2014 Scottish referendum. Harold Wilson had fought, 5 elections as leader of the Labour Party. He fought something like 15 elections. There's a sense that you've lived through different kinds of campaigns with different rhythms, different alignments of opinion, and that range of opinion wasn't there, as it had been in the 70s.
I'll probably bring things to a close. I'm Derek McCauley, I'm the librarian of the National Liberal Club. I would follow up, Duncan, if you want to hear Jonathan Parry and are not at the Lib Dem conference on the 24th of July, he's speaking in the National Liberal Club, 6:30. If you go to the NLC website, if you're not a member of the club, you can sign up as a guest, come to the meeting. I would like to go back to some of the view of liberalism and linked into free trade, internationalism as how it underpins this whole debate. And was the departure of Ralph Horace, etc., that free market brand of liberalism that eventually evolved into the Institute of Economic Affairs and into the neoliberalism as we now describe it, was that completely gone by 1975? And was Edmund Houghton, who was mentioned on screen, really a lone figure? He didn't seem even to reference that. It was all about the Welsh farmer, small farmers in Wales, rather than having an ideological liberal underpinning of anti-Europe.
Yes, one thing that struck me during the recorded presentation is that it's not an accident that it's the bits of the Liberal Party that are rooted in Wales and Scotland and Cornwall that tended to be Eurosceptic at that point in time, because they're worrying about things like the fishing industry, about Welsh hill farmers, and the fear is that Europe is going to be all about big business, it's going to be all about centralisation. And in the 1970s, of course, England is the most pro-European part of the United Kingdom, whereas Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland are more Eurosceptic, because there's this concern about being on the periphery of a Europe that will be centred on London, Berlin, or Bonn rather at that point, and Paris. And I suppose the issue that, to some extent, I talked earlier about how you could appeal to different bits of the liberal tradition, and I think, and you could interpret them in different ways. And I think we do see that with the liberals in the 1970s. Because, as you say, internationalism is a really crucial principle for liberals, as for socialists. But internationalism might mean working with your European friends and partners, or it might mean working with the Commonwealth and not drawing a wall around the island, around the continent of Europe. Being a free trader might mean supporting a common market in Europe, or it might mean not wanting to put up tariffs against the rest of the world, as you do inside the European community. Believing passionately in peace, as Richard Cobden would have done, might mean you support the European community because it's a great peace project. It's about ending the hostility between France and Germany. Or it might mean resisting the European project because you see it as a Cold War creation, which is about creating another force that will enhance tensions in the world and try to rival the Soviet Union and the USA. And the Liberals in this period, frankly, are a bit of a kind of collection of people who don't fit in the other parties. So there is a sort of certain, you could say, awkwardness or proud, rugged individualism of opinion within the party. But that means that they're all going to they're all picking up bits of broken glass from the shattered old Liberal Party. And it's all catching different bits of light and reflecting different bits of the party's past.
The jagged personalities haven't entirely disappeared.
I'm pleased to hear it.
Morgan,
should be more.
anything you want to add?
I am again not going to pronounce on the Liberal tradition.
Well, does either of you want to make any comment on anything you think we've missed so far?
No, just say it's been a pleasure. Thank you for
Yes,
having us.
likewise.
Well, it's been a pleasure for us, and I'd like to ask the audience to show their appreciation.